It's great to have you on the pod. For everyone listening, Alex Wu is a UPenn grad, a ex-trader from JP Morgan, a champion of executive search, and now the head of talent at Left Lane. And it's an honor to speak to someone at your caliber and have you kind of talk a little bit about what the VC world expects of TA leaders. And I'd love to hear a little bit about who you are and how you got to where you are now, and let our audience learn. They'll start the process.
Fantastic. And Eric, thank you for having me. You've been just so great to partner with on so many things, and, a great thought partner. So really just think highly of you and appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we both have learned through our journeys that a lot of our success comes from who you're around, and just being my whole strategy when I was coming up was find someone I want to be like and be next to them, and it'll rub off. And it's kind of the whole purpose of what Unicorn is trying to take the expertise that got you to where you are today. And, we have a lot of aspiring talent that's extremely good at what they do, who it's an unclear path to getting to your role of VP of Talent at Left Lane. So I guess, what is that role like for folks who are kind of either internal or in their first recruiting jobs? What is the role that you're doing today, and how'd you get there?
Sure. Yes, I'm SVP Talent at Left Lane Capital. We're a little bit over 1.47 billion in assets under management. A little bit about the fund, just if helpful. Consumer, primarily, consumer and S&B. Highly retentive business model. So think like 3 to 5 year with the customer, right? My role within the fund is I'm mostly portfolio facing. So I spent all my time with our great TA leaders, heads of people, CEOs, just thinking through what's the right way to grow. And that can mean so many things, right? And happy to go deeper there. But as I've really thought about, how I got here, sometimes it feels like an accident in many ways, right? I mean, and I don't know, I guess as I think about my career, it was a lot of just kind of like knowing the next 2 months, 3 months. And then, when you kind of get a call or there's a person you really trust, you just kind of trust your gut, right? And so, yeah, it's kind of been a series of accidents in many ways. But I think the one thing, if I had to say something I got right, was I was really good at, to your point, working with great people and not being afraid to take a risk when I thought like it was almost calculated risk, like it was someone I thought was really smart. Right. And I was like, I'm kind of okay being one of those first employees. Right. Yeah. Because it could be something really magical. And I'm fortunate enough that it worked out. Knock on wood. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I always have viewed TA like an apprenticeship. To my knowledge, there isn't a degree. You can't get a degree in search. There isn't one. I graduated with a marketing degree pre-Facebook. So the skills that I learned when I got into the market, it was really just leaning on the fact that I met some great people at school and in my first roles, and got a little lucky with finding recruiting. But you had an interesting start. You were at JP Morgan doing something wildly different. How did you go from, UPenn to JP Morgan into recruiting is a different path than a number of the other folks that I've had on the podcast or I've stood next to in my pursuit of greatness. How'd you make that move?
Yeah. So when I was at Penn, I loved just being in school, right? Like I actually like just reading and writing papers and wanted to be an archaeologist. My dad actually was like, hey, I love that idea for you. You have this thing called student loans, right? So maybe let's make some money, right? And so I kind of fell into the like, what is investment banking and what is sales and trading? I've always been really good at mental math. And so I ended up becoming a derivatives trader, focused mostly on FX and a little bit of interest rate swaps, which is really fun. And I think what I loved about that job, and even to today, is you live the news, right? You wake up in the morning and you're like, what happened in the 10 hours I was asleep, right? And I loved that.
Yeah.
And so even to this day, like I'm just constantly reading all the things, right? Because it's like kind of how I grew up in. And then from there, the people who ended up starting True Search, I linked up with their old firm, and then was an early employee at True. And that was like a wild and fantastic ride. True Search, one of the fastest growing retained search firms in the world. And I got to work for one of the fantastic founders who really just kind of taught me, like bottoms up, just like how to do the work and how to really take care of people and think about growing companies. And yeah, I really attribute so much of my career to him and to some of the other partners there who really took me under their wing. Yeah.
How'd you meet? How'd you get in from JP to that founder?
Yeah, it's really funny. So I was at JP Morgan, and then ultimately I'd actually met a couple really great people who were at the firm that, is, we'll say, related to True. And many True people started there, the founders of True. And so through there, I was one of two associates. The other associate was one ahead of me in hires. So I think he was number 135. I think I was 136. And so he brought me over. He recommended me. And a great
Awesome.
example of like just follow great people, right?
Yeah. The network effect.
Yeah.
What from JP did you take over to True Search? Like what if you had to tell somebody who's at the beginning of their recruiting career like what they should be focused on outside of what they're learning in recruiting, like what was an outside skill that was important as you got started? And it could just be I mean, staying up to date and being able to articulate and be relevant to your stakeholders what's going on is probably something I would mention, but if I didn't steal your thunder.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. So I think, there's all these different like routines people do online, right? And I think there are those people, and bless them, who wake up at 5 in the morning and they like go swim laps and they do a million things and like whatever. And that's great. That's fantastic. I am not that regimented. Wish I was. But what I'm pretty consistent on is I wake up, I try to always get in a little bit before everyone else because I want like an hour to drink my coffee. I want to like catch up on news outlets. I want to like really think about my day. And I want to make sure that I'm current on what's going on in the world because, for lack of a better term, that's like what matters to the business, right? And as partner to the business, you need to know what's going on. So if it's tariffs, if it's, war, whatever it is, like you should actually have an awareness and how that's impacting. And so that's something that I think has been really great for me. And then the second thing that I learned was just in terms of efficiency, I don't let my email run my day. So a big mistake I made early in my career was wake up, you have these emails, you freak out, right? Oh, and you just go top of inbox down. I learned this from a founder. She really taught me. She was like founder CEO. She said, think about what matters most in your day and then go through your email for basically priority, right? And then before you go to bed at night, make sure you hit up all your emails. But like your email inbox is never going to be as prioritized by like, relevance, we'll say, as just like actually taking a moment to think about it. And that for me was transformative.
I don't even know how I would share it, but it probably would be like an interesting thing to see if people would download is the like label and filter system that I put on Gmail. So like same, I always prided myself on getting to like inbox 0, but it wasn't because if you go top down, it's impossible. And the things that catch your attention mean someone
Yes.
who's more important gets left behind. But like I would have a candidates folder and a projects folder and just like meticulously getting rid of all that stuff was I wonder if I could. I'll talk to the team. I'm sure in this chat GPT era, we can
Problem.
elevate our email things. Well, okay, so now you're leading the talent function for a venture capital firm, which means you're interacting with founders all day. What is different about that than the True Search or the VMG experience? Like, what are the material things that are taking up your day, and like what resonates, what stays, what goes from that previous experience?
Sure. So being on the agency side, I always say to people, it's so hard. It is so hard to work at a search firm. It is so intense, right? It is so hard to work internal. Just bless the people who do it, right? The way I think about it is I am here to enable those people to do their jobs, right? And so by that, I mean, like, let's make sure that we actually have an org chart that makes sense. We start, literally when we actually give you funding, talking about that. Let's turn that into like, what are these different roles? What do they mean? When do you hire a VP versus a CXO? And how do we think about putting a process together where that's as efficient as possible? And, someone who's actually going to stay there and be an high impact player. And so that's where I spend most of my time. And then in terms of, I'd say, working with internal recruiters, for example, it's like, how do I also make sure they have what they need? And so a lot of it's that systems. How can I help with just showing best in class like data analytics and like ways to use basic things like your CRM to make your day a little bit easier, right? And then also, I mean, where I can be helpful, best practices and everything else. But what gets me most excited is really two things. I think the first is, and I've absolutely been the problem here, right? Is for so long, funds have given founders money and said, hey, here's X millions of dollars, go figure out how to grow, right? Call us in like the next board meeting. And like ultimately, inevitably, year, 6 months later, board says, oh, you way overhired, or oh, you way underhired, right? And it's this huge, massive freak out where people have to way overcorrect the other way, right? And so the way I've thought about it is like, hey, let's actually just be really thoughtful and like, congrats, you raise money. What does that mean? And how do we think about like as you go from X revenue to Y revenue, right? With this type of burn rate and this kind of industry. So if it's a marketplace, it's different than digital health. How do we think about scaling that? Only where it's one build and not 4 different rebuilds of your go-to-market. right? And that's what really gets me excited. And there's never a perfect answer because I think every founder would tell you that they would redo it 3 different ways, right? But I think that's kind of like the magic.
Myself included. Yeah. No, I have to
Exactly.
imagine that you seeing hundreds of executives play out through your executive search career. Like you've placed them, you've seen who's worked, who's bounced, who's stayed, who's progressed. I'm sure you have repeat placements, right? Like knowing a formula or like having the experience of placing so many executives means you can better align who's going to fit at what check size or what stage or what part of the founder life cycle someone's within. How do you go about demand plan? Do you have like a strategy around like an input like check size or existing number of heads or that you start from, or are you doing a custom analysis like a custom demand plan for each founder?
It's relatively custom. So the way I think about it is, yes, I've seen many executives, into roles, right? Placed into roles, but that's almost like the end, we'll say like the last mile of the supply chain, right? The way I think about it is like I've been fortunate enough to have a seat between, VMG and then now Left Lane. I've seen hundreds of companies scale, right? And then if you include true thousands, right? And so the way I've thought about it is like, hey, like generally in a marketplace business, by the time you hit 30 million revenue, you kind of need to go from a VP marketing to a CMO because that's when your marketing spend hits certain points, right? And so that's how I think about it is how can I be smart on different markers in a business? Which is why, again, I think it's so important to read the news, right? And like really thinking about it that way. And so when I think about demand planning, it's taking all of that. And then it's also speaking with experts. So like, I don't know every business model, especially in international, how to scale perfectly, right? I know generally like, you need this many SDRs if you're going to do this much revenue and everything else. But the way I think about it is I start with like, okay, so here's where you kind of currently are in terms of revenue. I usually use revenue, not valuation. Here's where you generally want to be by your next fundraise. Let's think together in terms of burn rate and other things. What would make you, for lack of a better term, look good at that fundraise? And then by function, let's back into what do you need? And what you need in year 2 or year 3 is totally different than what you need right now, right? So we're going to say that, okay, by the time you're spending X amount in marketing spend, you're really revving up all those channels. That's going to be in 18 months. So until then, let's get like a really good director, right? And then as we think about, okay, what's that director going to do? Okay, well, are they going to be doing SEO? Are they going to be just buying a ton of things on, Meta? Like, how do we think about your marketing spend and then who that actually turns into, right? And then you do the same on finance. Okay, like you're a SaaS business, you need somebody who understands financial planning and analysis, right? You'll probably do your external audit in like a year or two, right? And so I kind of back into it using like, what do you need to do in the company? And then that's actually what really drives it. And I'd say some of that is like general best practices, but some of it's also like by industry, right? Like, I don't think a SaaS business is built the same way as a marketplace, for example.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting using revenue targets as an input for like headcount demand planning. So thinking about where the future needs to be and associating a production or a revenue with each person so that by the time you hit your goals, you're at the next revenue target. And I would say a lot of demand planning that I see tends to be bottom up, right? It's requested by the hiring teams like, I need X, Y, and Z. And it might be on a production level scale. It might be like on sellers to revenue and not like a CMO or versus a VP on revenue. But it's a completely different perspective at the exec level that I think super interesting to get into. Like what other inputs outside of, like if you couldn't use revenue, right? What other things are you looking at for kind of like markers of a business that help you make these determinations?
Sure. So it really is by function. And what we always say is, by the way, you're going to have a functional expert come in who is going to edit this, right? These are like general rules. It's a forecast, right? Yeah, I mean, so just to kind of rip through them, let's see. We'll say marketing, like I mentioned, it's really marketing spend. I mean, that is by far the most important. And as you think about hiring a marketer, and so I would say once you start getting to like monthly spend, that's like at a certain, honestly, volume, you need somebody who's an expert in really optimizing those channels. And who's honestly a little bit of a manager of managers, right? And then I would say, as you think about the finance function, it's when are you going to do an external audit? Which is usually as you start thinking about big milestones, like, okay, you're going to do a really big, like you're going to do a growth round fundraise, right? And so I would say, as you think about an external audit, as you think about things like, the complexity of your cap table, how many people are you managing? in terms of like investors and other stakeholders? Are you doing debt in addition to equity? That's when you start thinking about like a VP finance or a CFO even. And then as you think about operations, it's so dependent on business, but I'd say that's really around like burn rate. And then if it's something like CPG, we do a lot around, as you guessed, like fulfillment and everything else. But I really look at like, I mean, it sounds so hokey, but it's so critical by function, what's going on, because it's really that more so than like a valuation that's going to tell you what you need in that business, right? The way you build an AI company is totally different than the way you build a CPG company, even if in theory they have similar valuations or
And
revenue.
what is the interaction between the founders and this process? Like, how involved are they, and what inputs are they giving? Like, how do you manage the readiness of that founder to take on additional senior heads like this? Like, how are you managing that relationship?
Yeah, I think it's about meeting people where they are. So it's with the founder. And so what we'll say is, hey, you raised this money, right? Let's have a sit down session. And we'll usually come with like a general, this is what companies like you who have done the chapter that you're about to do, this is how they did it, right? Like general org chart, right? And then people will kind of give their own magic. They'll say like, oh, no, 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 no. Like my magic is that I've merged. So I've heard this a couple of times. I've merged product and marketing in the following ways. And that's what's been like a part of my growth engine, right? You're like, great, right? But then let's think about, okay, well, what's going on in finance, right? And so it's incredibly interactive. I think what's critical is to recognize everybody's starting from a different place with this. Some people have been thinking about it nonstop. Other people have not thought about it at all. And some people have really strong opinions on how they want to scale and like what's, for lack of a better term, like untouchable in their org or what makes them special versus the generic. And then other people are like, hey, I would actually love to talk to the CRO of fill in the blank PLG growth company. We're like, oh, great, we know that, right? They would be happy to tell you about the 5 ways they rebuilt their go-to-market, right? Before we put this on paper. And so I think of that discovery process as that initial session. And then it's, really like 2 weeks of work after that.
Okay. And then it's into the founder's hands to go execute. Then you're touching base, or you're supporting them with the resources that you've built, or any sort of, are you doing search at Left Lane or no?
I do. Yeah. So from there, there's a really critical middle step, which is, okay, great. So here's your forecast of who you need to hire in the next 12 to 18 months, right? Let's start thinking about those top critical hires. One of the ones we love to make early on is a chief of staff. And so I love to work with a chief of staff on this, or a head of people. And so that person will then own the document. And that's critical because otherwise it gets very old very quickly, as you would guess, right? And so as you hire people in, everyone's going to say, oh, no, 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 I need X amount, not this, right? I need this headcount. You go, great. Okay, well, then where are we going to get those dollars, right? Which I'm sure you've played this game before.
You're speaking my language, yes.
Right. And so that game of trade-offs is really owned by someone in the company
Right.
with the founder. Right. And so
Okay.
I'd say that day-to-day management is like, it should be internal. Right. But
Yeah.
then, yeah. Yeah.
How is AI infiltrating the model with which people are building their headcount plans within the portfolio? So are people expecting more with less at the executive level, or when you're doing these bigger org charts, specifically around maybe spend or total staff? But are you seeing that, like, in your world? Are you seeing an influence yet from the new tooling that's come out in the space?
Yes, to put it lightly. So not sure if people saw, but I believe it's Shopify CEO had a really interesting note around this recently. And we've been talking about a good deal, which is thinking about the business case for a hire as one of many things in the toolkit, right? And so the reality is the way we're building companies today is totally different than how we built companies in 2013 or whatever I started, right? And so, yes, it's been really interesting to see that. And then I'd say even personally, I am really excited that I actually run as a team of one. And the way I'm able to do that, 80 portfolio companies, 40 investors, as you'd guess, significant amount of stakeholders involved, is actually being powered by AI and tech, right? So I use a variety of tools that are actually, and incredible vendors who are actually able to really kind of turbo me. Where, traditionally, if I was even building a talent team 5 years ago, it probably would have been me and 4 other people.
Awesome. Okay. And I would say a big thing so my background before doing the headcount thing, and what Unicorn was before it was a community, was a consulting firm where we would operate on behalf of VCs to go, swoop into a TA and help them get to a production that meets OpEx and revenue goals, right? That was our whole, there's always a relationship between the founders and the VC that people are interested to know, like, what is the founder's relationship with you or the talent organization? Like, how do they call upon you? What are the things outside of the org or the demand planning? Like, what are the things that they're ad hoc reaching out? And how do you, create a queue to serve them, or like how do you know what you can and can't do to support them in that way? So like how do you support those founders?
Yeah, I mean, the way I've thought about it is everyone is so different in what they need. So, lack of a better term, it's kind of meeting the customer. And I think of the founders as the customer, right, where they are. And so, I'd say like an early stage founder, I'm essentially they're out of people, right? So if you think of like a under 10 million revenue company, I'm setting up the PEO. I'm doing a lot of just like the basic compliance grunt work. I'm making sure I call it like make it sure we don't get sued HR, right? In addition to building some of that like initial just talent infrastructure. And then on the other side, companies that are a couple hundred million revenue, I mean, they have like fantastic internal organizations of people who think about these things all day. I'm more a sounding board for like, hey, like, have you generally seen this before? Because I think the one thing as the VC you can offer is pattern matching, right? We've seen so many companies go through. And so we're able to say like, oh, I remember this one business at this one time saw something similar. Would you want to, speak to that founder? And also, by the way, this is, how we thought about it when we were building that org, right? Or when we were kind of retooling this or that. So that's how I think about it, is like really almost just being like a library of information, and then also just a sounding board of someone outside of the organization who's able to kind of just like, for lack of a better term, think strategically about like, okay, well, where are you headed and where are you today and how do we get there? Right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think as a founder, the things that I'm leaning on the investors for are the things that I've never seen, and for the things that we both haven't seen. So as you do raises in different climates, tariffs or no tariffs, whatever, you have like all this different context that it might not be a previous tariff that they're advising you through, but it's a similar economic swing. And they're like advising you on what resonates with folks who have deployable capital. So it's like a very, when you find the right investor, it's a great relationship that really does help you build something special. What's the theme of 2025 so far? Are you seeing like a certain problem or inquiry emerge that comes from the portfolio about anything related to the current environment or to the business world? But is there a theme so far that you're seeing emerging for this year?
I am nervous to say it, but I'm going to go ahead. Hopefully this doesn't come back to haunt me. I think growth. So last couple years was such a focus on doing more with less, right? And that was needed. And I think, it was a little bit of whiplash, for lack of a better term, from, COVID era and, zero interest rate policy. But we're now getting to a point where questions are no longer around how do I make sure my burn makes sense? It's now how do I make sure that I'm growing in the right way? And that's been really fun to talk about. And it's actually been really interesting. I'd say founders are asking us more now than they ever have around product-led growth. What does it mean? How do I think about the right org chart for that? And specifically, I'd say, how can we better merge the product organization and the marketing organization to essentially be one? And that's been an incredibly interesting theme this year.
Yeah, I've explored it. We're not ready yet. We'll go when it's time, but we still have to be super hands-on. But it is a very enticing model, probably more applicable in the consumer space, but nonetheless, it does make for a much different like growth spend model.
Mm-hmm.
Any metric you look at, anything that's like the North Star for how you advise
around product-led growth, or around what specifically?
Yeah, like what makes it?
So I would say it's part of it is how much are you willing to be self-serve? Because I think many founders are excited by the idea of like, how can we help people who fall in love with the product, right? Get the most out of the product without essentially having to go through like a full sales cycle. And so thinking about how much are you okay with being self-serve, how do you set yourself to succeed in a self-serve is incredibly top of mind. And then I would say it's really around just like metrics for your sales team. And I don't think anyone's perfected this yet, or anyone I've spoken to, but like, how do you think about ensuring that the sales team is incentivized to continue to talk to product and tech and other parts of the org on what customers are saying, in addition to holding a quota and all the other things you do as a salesperson, and also pushing product to the right people has been super top of mind. And then there have been really interesting new roles coming out. So someone who's focused entirely on monetization. So like your paywall, right? When is it free? When do you start to actually charge? How do you think about workflows, like ensuring people are signing up with their work email? So then you can identify where there might be enterprise, users just sitting within these large companies who just love your product. And so I think there have been just some really interesting roles in addition to like Yeah, everyone's just kind of figuring out some of the trade-offs of product-led growth.
I had a good friend who he founded a board game company, but came from like phone games, the free phone games, and his whole job was monetization. And he walked through the models of like how to drive towards profitability in something that's been given out for free for a certain period of time. And it's just the math behind it is it's such an interesting way to think about developing products because it's just different. Like when we think about it in B2B SaaS, we're creating for a recurring revenue, but creating for some sort of conversion is just it's a whole other level of thought that, maybe someday I'll start a company that has a PLG component to it, but TBD.
I would say they're incredibly different roles, right? I would say the magic of being internal is you're so concentrated. You see one story and you go so deep, and like you're living that every day. And there is something to be said for operating, right? And so I would say that is absolutely an incredible experience, especially if you're at a company you really believe in, right? Even if you also think about financially, right? That can be incredibly lucrative. Search firms, I think, are fantastic for people who love just almost like I call it like love of the game. Like they just want to be out there hunting, right? It's just like that's what excites them is it's outreach, it's interviews, it's like closing candidates, right? I almost describe it as being in private equity versus being an investment banker. Like in our world, the search firms are like the investment bankers. They just love deals, right? And then the way I think about it, and I've explained this to some of my friends as they've gone onto this side, is in venture, you have so many stakeholders and they really are spending all day reading the news and thinking about these big ideas. And like, you have to kind of meet them where they are. And I think that's so fun. And like, they want to talk all day about how they think AI is going to transform the world, right? And you're this tiny little piece of, okay, well, how do we make that happen with, thinking about org, right? But I'd say the part that makes it hard, and I love this part, is like, if you have a bad hire at a company, I joke, I will hear about that every day for 6 months, right? Like if I have a bad hire, I don't know if it's the same with internal, but like if I hire a bad VP of whatever, right? I joke like that investor will come over to my desk and be like, oh, came up again, right? And you're like, oh goodness. And so I would say it really is quality. Whereas if you're at a
Yeah.
search firm, it's a little bit less removed, right? But that's probably like the only downside. But in a way, it's an upside because I think it also makes you really focus on hiring the right people.
Right. Yeah. I would, I've done all three. I never made it in search. I did granted, I did account temps
Mhm.
in it was my first recruiting job. I did Robert Half International and I did account temps in 2009. That was bad timing. Made it 6 months, but it did get me my start in recruiting, and I understand what it is. But what I like the people who I was next to at the time were like, oh, with LinkedIn coming out, there's no need for search firms anymore. Right. So I went through that. And then like I hear they're grumbling now, like, oh, with AI, there's going to be no need for search firms. And I wonder, is there ever going to be a time where there's not a need for a search firm? Or is it just always going to be something in demand given the nature of the recruiting process?
Probably I'm a little bit biased in this because I spent all of my time in executive level, right? But to me, that will always need a human because you're playing therapist, right? You're helping these people with these massive packages, or, we'll just say, their family income usually. Think through, is this the right step for me? And that is late night phone calls. That's like, thinking about like, how do I help this person see the opportunity or also, think about the downside, right? Like that is so human. And a
Yeah.
computer could never do that. And I also think some of the best placements I've ever had personally weren't obvious on paper. So they weren't from a direct competitor. They hadn't done that exact job, right? But it's like I knew them. I knew their references and like we knew that was just like a person to bet on and that they like would get that founder. And then that founder met them, they hit it off immediately and it was a perfect fit, right? And so to me, I mean, there's probably many parts of recruiting like sourcing that could have a lot of AI opportunity or, outbound, right? But yeah, I think so much of it is still so human, at least to me, which will always
I
require
heard
firms.
I heard a take the other day that was when every single async communication is perfect, the only thing left is in person. When every single email you get is perfect, then the only thing that stands out is like the in person that's right in front of you. So TV, it's too early for me to see how that will actually play out. I experienced a little bit like running a BDR function at headcount,
Mhm.
I can see the difference between when AI really started to take off versus when I started my cold email process a long time ago. Like I know what's happening with the conversion rates. And I even used to do this at previous jobs. I won't name a specific one, but I used to like have errors
Yeah.
in the subject line, or so that people knew that it wasn't perfect, or it wasn't like, so formally capitalized. So I
Right.
don't know what that means, but it did work. We're still experimenting with how AI improves the conversion rates. It definitely does really well on volume, but we'll see.
Yeah.
You know, let's talk about what Left Lane's working on, and where you want to drive folks that are interested in the portfolio companies that you're currently supporting. If folks want to learn more about you, if they want to learn more about Left Lane, where should we send them? Either to apply or to learn more.
Yeah, so I think the biggest, best kept secret in venture, for reasons unknown why this isn't advertised better, is the job boards on venture capital websites. So absolutely go to Left Lane's website. We have a job board. It has almost 600 jobs, probably over 600 jobs, and check it out. And it's an aggregator of all of our portfolio companies. Right. So it's a great place to go to one-stop shop and see everything going on. So definitely check that out. Yeah, we've been doing some really exciting things. So AI, and then we've been really interesting around a thesis of, we call it like the not AIable, which is to us sports, for example. I mean, people are always going to watch like, humans compete, right? And so Love, which is a women's volleyball league, pro volleyball league, is always hiring. And some other names in there you'll see as well are always growing and growing. And so check them out. And then I'd say, yeah, in addition to in the States, we also are pretty significant, I'd say, in Latin America and then in Europe. So even if those are abroad, definitely check us out.
Okay. Who do you follow? What books do you read? What news do you read? Where should people look to find the information that you're following?
Yeah, so I start my free plug for them. I start my day every morning with the Morning Brew podcast. If anybody else reads that, I think that's a good one. They also have some great just newsletters. I do a little bit of a scan through everything. I heard Jamie Dimon does this. And I think, as a 21-year-old at JP Morgan, I wanted to do whatever Jamie Dimon was doing, right? And so he's like notorious for reading multiple newspapers every single morning. So I do the same thing. So I'll listen to a podcast, news podcast, just as like I'm waking up. But then when I get to my desk, I have my cup of coffee. I take like 30 to 45 minutes where I'll just flip through to CNN, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Economist, and then Financial Times, just to see what's going on in Europe. And those usually get me like 80% there. And then, sometimes I'll actually make a point to read the op-eds, because I think that's where you can kind of see some hot takes on either side. And so I think sometimes that's also important, even if it's, we'll say not my personal opinion. I think it's good just to think about how is, at any given point in time, half of America thinking about something.
I always read the other side. I won't say which side I'm on, but I always read the other side just so that I understand, because I know what, I don't think we're having any fresh takes recently. So I like to hear like what convinces people to do whatever it is that they're doing, and what are they leaning into, and how do they take something that I've seen with my eyes and how do they interpret it through their lens, so that I understand how to apply that to other things that maybe I haven't experienced. Super helpful. I always recommend that people do that regardless of what side you're on. It's a good strategy to get as much information as possible. I'm very similar, and I'll continue to do that. Any favorite book? Any business book that you're like, this is the one, or current events and current events?
Let's see. I read a good deal, and I think I'm one of those people that it's certain passages will speak to me rather than like an entire book, right? And so I believe it's Malcolm Gladwell. I think it's Talking with Strangers, but I would highly recommend the chapter on essentially people think they're good at knowing what other people are thinking, right? But there's so much data around the fact that we have no idea what's going on in other people's brains, and just how much bias happens by us even thinking that we can like judge someone's character off a 45-minute interview or 3-hour dinner. And so highly recommend that specific chapter of that book. For me, that was transformative, especially in what we do.
Agreed. Yes. What advice do you have for candidates that are trying to get in at Left Lane? Any particular way in other than and taking a look and giving it an apply?
Yeah, hustle. I think, like we were laughing about the other day, someone involved with the fund got in touch with a company by just saying like, hey, you have the same last name as me, to a founder. right? And that was email number 12 and got the person to reply, right? And so just like straight hustle and like have some fun with it. And I think, yeah, I mean, people really respect people who just won't take no for an answer and not to just be like, hi, I want to work here, but why do you want to work there? Right. And something that's thoughtful and from the heart. I think people really, appreciate that, especially founders.
Yeah, as a founder, couldn't agree more. The folks that I've ended up hiring have all had some level of like personal interaction. There's very few inbound applications that, for whatever reason, have made it to the bottom of the funnel. And
Hmm.
the persistence and the interest always catch my attention before an inbound. So, well, I love having a conversation and learn a little bit more about your take in the VC world. And for those who are listening, to follow Alex, you could do so on LinkedIn. We'll put a link down below for the job board for Left Lane and some of the materials that you referenced. And yeah, we look forward to following Left Lane, seeing where you guys go.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And hopefully I'll see you next time you pass through New York. But I
Yeah, for
appreciate
sure.
it. And yeah, take care. Have a good one.
All right. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks.